a special area of our panelists. We will just invite he or she come in the center, and we do this way. And for each of you, if you have a question and trying to be concise and straightforward and ask a question rather than make some statement. And also we mentioned that don't treat our panelists as a spokesman of a particular country or organization. They only represent themselves. So, okay, any questions? Should we take
You take it first.
We take a few questions and...
2 or 3.
Okay.
Multiple questions, one question.
One question per
Okay.
one person. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, hi, my name is Z. I'm an undergrad at George Mason University. My question is on the economic front of this conflict. As we know, when we look at the regional wider map, we see the three economic giants, China, Japan, and South Korea. So, in my way of thinking, I always view it like the romance of the three kingdoms. Wei, Shu, Wu. And when China press on too hard on Japan, it not only burns Japan, but also burns China. But that keeps South Korea afloat. So my question is that, what is the Korean view on this economic conflict between China and Japan? Thank you.
Okay, so that's the first question about the Korean role in this conflict. And maybe we take a couple of other questions so we can assign the questions to our panelists. Okay.
Hi, my name is Chris Mancini. I'm with the Eurasia Center. You spoke about possible oil reserves, and so my question is, if there were significant reserves, what do you foresee for the future of that? Is there any possibility of a joint venture between Japan and China, or if there are other options on the table?
Okay. Maybe one more question? Yeah.
Joelle Metcalf from Waseda University in Tokyo. I also did a study abroad at Peking University, so I could understand Chinese and Japanese perspectives on this issue. My question is in regards to education. I believe that Dr. Kimijima said that education is going to be incredibly important in, sort of channeling the nationalism. But my question is about how is the education of the current political leadership in China and Japan, how those leaders were taught to view the islands, how is that going to have a significant factor? For instance, Xi Jinping's new administration versus Abe's administration, how were these two leaders educated to view the islands? Are they supposed to be viewed in a nationalistic way? Or what is the current view, the current education on the islands versus what can be done in the future to change that? And are both sides willing to change those views?
Maybe we take one more question and we answer them together, okay?
You mentioned, my name is Kikuchi, Kunio Kikuchi, and about the perception gap between Japan and China at the people's level. When you go to China and stay up late at night, you see these endless, every day, how terrible the Imperial Japanese army is. They are the hateful, they pillage, plunder, and do all the nasty things to Chinese people. Every night. Now, in Japan's side, all we hear is how nice the Chinese people were, especially when the Japanese were evacuating from their colonies. The Chinese people protected them from the Soviets and how nice they are. Now, my question is, why does the Chinese government continue to promote these venomous, hateful programs, which is totally totally rejected by the Japanese people themselves? Or in fact, they don't even talk about 1930s, what the Imperial Japanese Army did, because we rejected the military at the end of the war. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for these questions. Maybe we do this way. How about we invite, since there's a question about the, you speak from here?
No, I think, unless you
Because
speak.
we have the video.
We'll bring you a microphone.
No, the camera is out.
The problem is the
Camera.
camera.
So please come over here.
Okay. Yeah. So, yeah, so
About-
maybe we address this
is-
question briefly, yeah.
Which question? You have to define the question. There are 4 questions.
The first
Korean
question-
role,
Yeah,
maybe.
the first question about the South Korea view of the this tension, especially in terms of economic relationship of the 3 countries, whether it's an opportunity for South Korea or something, right?
Yeah.
I have not studied from this aspect what kind of role that Korean can play. But from my gut feeling is that maybe it's not the role in supporting Sino-Japanese relations. Maybe it's a chance for Korean companies to get some share from Japanese company in China market. Maybe it's not only Korean company, but also Germany, American. Is that okay?
Thank you.
Okay. And for second question about oil reserve, I think since that Mr. Fukuda, you have talked about this issue, and what do you think about the possibility of joint venture between China, Japan?
What we know about the oil there is there's just potential. That's what was reported by the UN body. So if commercial quantities of oil were discovered, I think a joint venture could move from exploration to development. So I think that would be possible.
Okay, for the third question about education, the fourth question about perception gap, and especially why Chinese government promote this kind of hateful education program. Maybe I just volunteer that I take the lead to answer briefly, and then maybe any of the panelists can add. Actually, we talked quite a lot yesterday about nationalism, about identity politics in these 2 countries. I think there's really some misunderstandings between both sides. First, when we talk about the Chinese nationalism, for example, many of our Japanese friends would ask that why the Chinese, they're so angry, why they're so emotional. And I think the answer, of course, is not a simple one, but one of the very fundamental one is that for Chinese, actually our presentation, actually Professor Kimijima has also mentioned about that. The war with Japan, which although it's happened many years ago, and for today's Japanese, maybe you can say this is something, long time ago. It's conducted by our ancestors, which we have totally no control of. But for China, for the country, it's really not just something in the history textbook. During the war, over 900 Chinese cities has been occupied. If you visit any of the cities, you will naturally run into some museums, monuments, and many of the Chinese people, they can tell you some of the family stories related with this bad part of the history. Of course, the government education program played a role, but we have to say this way, it's a common kind of understanding about that is the government somehow intentionally promoting this kind of anti-Japan or even anti-US education. I think this is probably also not really the the fact. Because that basically, actually I wrote a book about that, and I made a book presentation not long ago at Wilson Center. I think that when the Chinese government conducted the so-called the patriotic education campaign after the 1989 students' movement, the main purpose for this government is actually to use this part of the history to somehow to improve the social cohesion of the country. And the main purpose, number one purpose, I think, is when the communism, when socialism, when the party is no longer, the legitimacy of the party has already gone after this students' movement, after this political change, they desperately need to have something to fill this vacuum. And they choose to use history. And history is also not something, I mean, the historic grievance is also not something only started from the Communist Party. It's actually being used by Sun Yat-sen to Chiang Kai-shek. It's always some important force in the Chinese Revolution and China's reform in recent years. And another argument maybe we can say is that Chinese nationalism has many faces. And one part of it, you can say it from the demonstrations in September. During yesterday's discussion, we're actually trying to, for example, I'm trying to explain more about how to correctly understand the demonstration in September. Of course, people can say some, the young people holding the banners, they put some improper language there. But we have to take it in a more broader views, rather than, otherwise there will be major misunderstandings about because first, they are only the minority group of Chinese people. And also that in any society, when some people go to the extreme side, that maybe their voice can be very loud, but they are not really represent the mainstream of the people's ideas. And also that I think that it's another side of the Chinese nationalism is actually, it has also been used as kind of a positive force for social change for many years. So I don't know whether any of our panelists want to add any.
Let's go to other questions.
Mm-hmm.
Right, some questions. Okay, so maybe we can take one or two more questions, please. That lady, yes.
Thank you. My name is Jean Nguyen with Voice of Vietnamese Americans. I thank the Woodrow Wilson Center for having this. So since we're here, can I ask a question about policy? And would both the Chinese partners and the Japanese, would you view this as a global situation, since it's also having impacts on global peace and security, and it's also involving the U.S.? Where do you see that we can use the UNCLOS, the United Nations Conventions on the Sea of the Law? And also, would this be a step forward so the Chinese government and the Japanese government can support the code of conduct in the South China Sea, which I think would also having impacts on the Chinese people as well? And I'd like to say to Dr. Wang that I empathize with your point from the Chinese people, and I am in your shoes, the Vietnamese people, sharing the Chinese people, we're in your shoes when we're looking at how the Chinese people acting toward Vietnamese. Thank you.
Thank you. Is that lady up there?
A reporter from the Voice of America. I have two questions here. One is for Professor Quan Sheng Zhao, and the other for Mr. Professor Kimi Jima. Professor Zhao, you mentioned in your speech that the U.S. pivot to Asia actually serving as a background to the island disputes. So I'm just wondering, could you elaborate on it? How does it affect the dispute. And also for Professor Kimijima, you mentioned the perception gap between the U.S. and Japan airlines actually also contribute to the disputes. So could you elaborate on that too? Thank you.
Okay. I think we are told that we have to leave the room at some point in the future. So I think we're going to take questions. And then if time remains, we can take more questions. I think I want to volunteer for the first question about the global context. And then we have Professor Zhao and Professor Kimijima. As to the first question as to whether or not this is a global issue with respect to the maritime space and beyond, I'll answer unanimously from this panel. I think you got the message. Absolutely, yes. And in terms of how we view the global nature of the situation, we had different views. But Professor Zhao's first statement about which parties are involved, in my view, is quite important. Let me just paraphrase the global nature of it by saying, to me, it is a set of five relationships. Number one is Japan-China, over the interconnected nature of those countries, economic, maritime security, and other ties, especially over Taiwan. Number two is Japan-China relationship. History on the one hand, economics on the other hand, the balanced intricacy of it. Number three is US-Japan relationships that Professor Kimijima mentioned. From the Japanese point of view, the new sort of way of United States engaging in the Asia-Pacific, as well as the Okinawa question. I think everybody knows about it. Number three is the relationship between the Japanese mainland and Okinawa, a hidden issue, so to speak. Nobody talks about it in the context of this. But Okinawa communities, which for centuries have very intimate ties to the region in search of the sphere of life through fishery, tourism, etc., etc., etc. And number five is the relationship between, of course, mainland China and Taiwan. And there is number six. Six is the relationship between those five relationships. And that is the most important relationship. I think we always think in terms of very dichotomous small piece things, but we need holistic systems thinking. It is in this context that we look at Senkaku Daoyu. Now, to be concrete, I think for us to talk about the code of conduct and whatnot, that is very important. But what we actually brainstormed yesterday included what we should do immediately. To get to a discussion about the code of conduct, we have some immediate steps. The tension continues to be high. And then many people have different ways of looking at it. I see this territorial sovereignty as an intersection of 3 or 4 different disagreements. Number one is a disagreement about territorial sovereignty, which is exclusive. Number two is a disagreement about the use of the resources and maritime space. Use is different from sovereignty ownership claim, isn't it? And we also have a disagreement about whether shelving the territorial dispute has been there or not. So it is more of a perception/relationship difference. And all those 3 differences or disagreements or lack thereof are contextualized in a larger perspective, which I just described. Security, economics, culture/identity, politics, including domestic politics that Professor Fujishira talked about. And as Professor Zhao mentioned, I think all of us, the panelists, seem to have agreed that peaceful means is the right way. But to be concrete, personally, it's not the panel consensus. I have a 3-point proposal as to how to overcome beginning to overcome the dilemma. Freezing is one way not to talk about it. Status quo, one way or another, is way. But we have to be explicit. Point number 1 is the Japanese government affirms its firm commitment to territorial claim. But it also acknowledges the Chinese position of it. Point number 2, Chinese government affirms its territorial sovereignty over the territory, and it acknowledges the Japanese position. Number 3, two sides acknowledge the differences, but remain committed to using peaceful means to resolve the differences. Please note that in this 3-point formula, the Japanese side did not have to compromise on the territorial claim. Chinese side does not have to. However, they agree to disagree So 1-point formula out of 3 is agree to disagree through peaceful means. So that's my response. And then we go to Professor Zhao about the pivot question.
Okay, thank you for VOA question. The question actually can be divided into 2 parts. One, whether U.S. is a part of this dispute, and 2, anything to do with the pivot policy. The first one, I guess, is very obvious. That is the 72 return the Diaoyu Sankaku Island together with Okinawa to Japan itself constitute the very fact that the U.S. was part of that. And also, even up to today, the most recent Hillary Clinton's statement making a number of points. That is, one, U.S. would not take a position in the ultimate sovereign issue, and 2, it would under U.S.-Japan security alliance in terms of administrative right of Japan over the island. And specifically, the statement also mentioning the U.S. would oppose any unilateral change of status quo. So all of that indicate that is very clearly, so it's not only U.S.-Japan, China-Japan dispute, but the United States. It's not only part of that, but also a key party. The second point, I would say actually yesterday, we also discussed in detail about the U.S. Current and potential future role. Not only that, actually, out of a number of small islands in this group of Sankaku Diaoyu, several, 2, 3, still currently under administration of the United States. It's not totally under Japan. That was 2. Yesterday we discussed this particular issue. So in practical terms, there are 2 directly still under administrative rule of the United States. But given, and the bigger picture is that with this policy we just mentioned, yesterday I also mentioned in my discussion that would put U.S. in a no-lose situation. Whatever future result, for example, if Japan ultimately prevailed over this island dispute, then the United States would say, well, this is because of my commitment to Japan. We honored our U.S.-Japan alliance. We made very clear, so ultimately that Japan still can keep that. But on the other hand, if China prevailed in the future, then U.S. still has a say, saying, see, I'm taking a neutral position, in terms of ultimate sovereignty. So in other words, it seems like in whatever the result, it is a lose-lose situation for China and Japan, because obviously the damage. Let's say if there is a war, unless if there is a war, there will be lose-lose. But the United States in a position that in a moral standard can say to both sides, and moreover. Having said that, I'm not saying that U.S. would like to see a disruption in terms of regional stability. So regional stability is still very high in the target. So whatever you can quarrel, but you should not fight. I guess that's the bottom line. Having said that, in terms of a pivot policy, we all understand that the United States has a hygiene policy with China. On the one side is cooperation. Hopeful China could have a peaceful rise and then integrate into international community. On the other hand, always prepared for the worst. That's one security idea. And with that direction, therefore, Japan would be indispensable for the United States security arrangement in Asia Pacific. So in terms of security, military, strategic arrangement, the United States would not want to see a drifting Japan. That is, Japan would drift from U.S.-Japan alliance. Like early, we also mentioned during discussion, Funabashi Yoichi in his 1990s book specifically described that kind of a tendency within Japan, that Japan may move away from the U.S.-Japan alliance. So that is not desirable. So this is the purpose, the whole picture here, that's the reason I mentioned the pivot to Asia-Pacific policy also can be served as a bigger background of the entire circumstances. Thank you.
So briefly, Professor Kimijima on U.S.-Japan security perception.
Thank you very much for your question. Well, my statement about the perception gap within U.S.-Japan alliance, it's more broader sense. So not particularly about the Senkaku Diaoyu Island issue. So I think there are a kind of perception gap with the Japanese government and the U.S. government at the moment, I think. So I think it's, well, I quote a statement, I read a media that Mr. Michael Green says the three things that Abe administration should not do: visiting the Yasukuni Shrine and revising the 1993 Kono statement about the so-called comfort women issue, and also the staying the Senkaku Islands, the government send somebody there on the Senkaku Islands. So there are, particularly the history, concerning the history, the past history, there is a difference of opinion between Tokyo and Washington, I think. So we should be really careful about that, I think. That's my statement. And if we mention the Senkaku Diaoyu Island issue, I quote one statement from a legislation. Recently, the Congress passed the National Defense Authorization Act for this year, and President Obama signed January 2nd this year. It says, while the United States takes no position on the ultimate sovereignty of the Senkaku Islands, the United States acknowledges the administration of Japan over the Senkaku Islands. So the Japanese government position is that Japan has the sovereignty, territorial sovereignty, but the United States takes no position. That's the U.S. official position. So there is a difference of perception on this issue too. Thank you.
I'm very sorry because that we have another event actually scheduled in the same room later on. And I would like to invite the director of the Asia program, Bob Hoswe, to come to give us like a closing remarks. And actually, we weren't able to do everything without Bob's help. So we are really very, very much appreciate. And before you, when you're working here, I just add one more thing. Is that actually today, one of the purpose we organize as our original plan after the public forum, we have a lunch meeting with press, with the media, is that we believe the media play a very, very important role in this tension. And now we know that the two countries, there's a very kind of like a mutual negative image or perceptions to the other side, and we believe actually the media of the two sides actually can play even bigger role in the future for the better relationship of the country. Actually, we hope that in the future, maybe there will be a dialogue between the media of the two countries. That could be another way of the, conflict resolution. Okay, now we just ask Bob to give us closing remarks.
After the wealth and the richness of our discussions today, there's very little I can add, so I'm going to start out by saying my closing remarks are going to be blessedly brief. But I think it's important to, first of all, recognize the terrific work over a period of many months on the part of the two gentlemen on either side of me. They are responsible for this entire process, not simply today's event, but also a very rich and full discussion all day long yesterday. They have been the brains behind this. They have had the creativity and the imagination to put it together. And at this moment, I'd like for you to join me in expressing our appreciation to them for all their work. I also want to acknowledge the heavy lifting done by Shioko Goto on my staff, who was on the phone at 5 minutes after 6 this morning, not with me, blessedly, trying to figure out what the closing of the federal government would mean for this. So Shioko certainly deserves a great deal of credit for today. In addition, thanks to Joshua and our friends in the Kissinger Institute, particularly Sandy and Elizabeth, but also Ambassador Roy. This is truly a team effort, and I am delighted to have played my small part. Perhaps most importantly, you guys out here have played your part. The fact that so many of you showed up today, indeed so many of you showed up, we didn't even have lunch for everybody because we simply thought the weather would intimidate you. And by golly, it didn't intimidate you, which I think says something about how important this issue is. It also says a great deal about your seriousness, and so thank all of you for coming. Nothing we do here at the Wilson Center can have any effect at all if it's not for people like you. So our thanks for you. Professor Arai, in his comments a minute ago, underscored the complexity of this issue by noting there were 6 different relationships involved. In fact, I think he underestimates the complexity because I think if we really want to unpack this dispute, we have to recognize that it is not entirely isolated from other territorial disputes in the region. Most notably, perhaps, contention among various countries in the South China Sea. Also, bilateral dispute between South Korea and Japan. The Japanese and the Russians still have unresolved disputes, as do the Chinese and the Indians. I'm not trying to make this unnecessarily complex, but I think for a number of the parties, and most particularly the Chinese and the Japanese, they don't have the luxury of considering the dispute which has taken our attention today. They don't have the luxury of considering that dispute in isolation from their other disputes. So I think we could go on and spin this out and come up with probably several dozen relationships. Again, it's just a very, very difficult problem, which is all the more reason why it has been so refreshing to see the sober-mindedness, the lack of polemics, the seriousness which has characterized today's discussion. Despite its complexity, I think we have identified a number of points on which we have consensus. I didn't hear anyone argue with the proposition that the stakes involved for all the parties to this dispute are so great that it would be virtually inconceivable and an act of heightened folly for anyone in any country to allow things to get to such a point where they might spin out of control. There seems to be unanimity on that point. There also seems to be unanimity on the fact that this dispute must be resolved peacefully, which obviously is related to the first point I just made. So, despite its complexity, there's clearly room to be optimistic, room to be hopeful that rational minds and wise men and women on all sides can do the right thing. It's been said of the United States that Americans generally end up doing the right thing after they've tried all the alternatives. One hopes that the parties to this dispute don't try all the alternatives before doing the right thing. But I remain optimistic, and in part I remain optimistic because of what has transpired here the last 2 days. The last point I would make is simply that the Wilson Center does hope to publish papers contributed by all the scholars who have been part of the project. So our consideration of this issue, our learning experience does not end today. Stay tuned, and we hope to have something in a very brief period of time that will continue this dialogue in a slightly different form. So I think on that note, unless either of my colleagues wish to, we will then call ourselves adjourned. Thank you all for attending.